Good morning. I was hoping to record this on the deck out behind the house with the pretty red trees in bloom or pink trees in bloom, but the pretty consistent rain today has kept me from doing that. As I was reading Oswald Chambers' devotional My Utmost for His Highest today, the first line goes like this: just because I don't understand what Jesus Christ says, I have no right to determine that he must be mistaken in what he says. Let me read that one more time. Just because I don't understand what Jesus Christ says, I have no right to determine that he must be mistaken in what he says. I thought that was quite good. As I was reading today, I was actually reading in the Gospel of Luke, and I came across two very familiar stories. If we are students of the Scriptures at all, we know them very well. The one is when Jesus goes with his disciples across the sea. They're going across the sea, and they get caught in the storm. He falls asleep in the boat. We remember that. And that is followed up by the story when Jesus goes up on shore and confronts the Gerasene demoniac, and he cleanses him. He casts out the demons, and of course the demoniac is sitting there in his right mind. And there's a couple of things that struck me about this. The first one, and I think the first one is something we've heard many times, and that is when Jesus sends the disciples across the sea in the storm, and Jesus is in the boat with them, and he falls asleep. We remember that, and the storm comes up and he's sleeping, and they say, don't you care that we're going to drown? And Jesus gets up and calms the storm, calms the waves. But there's a couple things. The first thing, and like I said, I think it's one that we've thought of many times. It's not a novel thought to us. We realize it. And that is, Jesus is in the midst of the storm with them. And I think that's an important reminder. And I realize we know it. We realize we've thought it. We realize we've heard it, and maybe even repeated it ourselves many times. But the reality is that whatever storm we're facing, whatever has us stirred up, whatever concerns, whatever worries, whatever fears, whatever storm that we find ourselves in, Jesus is in the midst of the storm with us. He's not on the other shore. He's right there in the midst of the storm, and he is resting in the storm, and we can rest in the storm because Jesus is there with us. But then something happens, and this is something that the two stories have in common, because when they wake Jesus up and they're all fearful because of the storm, Jesus calms the storm. And after Jesus calms the storm, there's no more fear of the storm. The storm is gone, if you will. It's been taken care of. But what we read that the disciples say at that point, it's in verse 25 of Luke chapter 8. Jesus is speaking to them, and he says, "Where is your faith?" They were fearful and amazed, saying to one another, "Who then is this, that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him?" It's quite interesting that they were fearful of the storm until they saw Jesus' incredible power even over that. And suddenly their fear switched. Now, in a very real sense, I could say their worship switched, because they began to get a glimpse of who this was that was in the storm with them and his power over the storm. Interestingly enough, we see a similar reaction in the very next story. Jesus has gone up and Jesus confronts the Gerasene demoniac, and remember that he's filled with many demons. When Jesus speaks to the demons, they refer to themselves as legion because there are many, and Jesus cleanses this man. And remember the story, of course, the demons request permission to not to be sent back to the abyss, but to go into this herd of swine. They go into the herd of swine, and of course they rush down into the water. But what's very interesting is we get a very similar response at the end of that story. We read in verse 35, still in Luke chapter 8, the people went out to see what had happened. And they came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had gone sitting down at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they became frightened. Isn't it amazing that in both these situations, what had been fearful circumstances, the storm, the demoniac, these are the things that had the people so uptight. These are the things that had the people so worried. These are the things that had the people so concerned. Jesus comes on the scene. Jesus stills the storm. Jesus heals the demoniac. Now they begin to see what kind of power is among them. And now they're more fearful of what Jesus can do than they are of what the circumstances can do. And the circumstances in which we find ourselves, I think, are similar because we can focus on the circumstances. And when we focus on the circumstances, a response will be that of fear. Or we can focus on the one that's above the circumstances. We can focus on the one that is more powerful than the circumstances. We can focus on the one that has power over the circumstances. And when we do that, when our focus is on Jesus and our focus is that of worship, suddenly we realize that the circumstances around us are not nearly as fearful as we thought they were. The writer of Hebrews says, "Fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith."